A royal guard was carrying the coffin of a dead hero when the cops stopped him. At first, it was just words. Then they started to push. The guard fell down after one powerful push. The casket broke open on the street, and for a brief moment, the fallen's face was seen to his family. The cop just smiled. He asked, "Was it worth it? For one dead soldier?" The crowd gasped in shame, and suddenly the engines roared. A convoy showed there, and King Charles himself got out. Before I show you exactly how the king dealt with those officers, please subscribe and like the video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Let's get started now. That late November morning in London had that special aspect that makes everything look like it belongs in a history book. The sharp light of fall pierced through the government buildings and cast long shadows on the clean tarmac of Whitehall, the kind of weather that makes visitors pull their coats tighter and natives move faster. Fresh, pure air that carries sound in a different way. Sergeant Thomas Wycliffe of the Grenadier Guards was at the center of it all. He was 6'2" tall in his scarlet tunic, and the tall bearskin added another foot to his already impressive frame. Every button on his uniform shone like a mirror. His white-gloved hands held the polished brass handles of a flag-draped coffin with the kind of steadiness that only comes from years of ceremony and months of grief. To the hundreds of people lining the pavements, he looked like every other ceremonial guard they'd seen in postcards, the perfect picture of British pageantry, polished and precise. But the people who were watching didn't know that Wycliffe had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the man in the coffin. They had shared foxholes in Helmand, split rations during 18-hour patrols, and watched each other's backs when the Taliban decided to test the wire around their forward operating base. There was a scar along Wycliffe's left forearm from shrapnel that had missed Corporal James Redding by inches. He could still hear James's laugh echoing through the mess tent after particularly bad days, always trying to keep morale up when everyone else was ready to crack. Wycliffe was the first to sign up for escort duty when the telegram got to Wellington Barracks 3 weeks ago. Not because it was an honor, though it was, but because James Redding deserved to come home, carried by someone who understood exactly what he had given up. The coffin wasn't just a ceremony for Wycliffe, it was personal. Behind the guards, the family walked with the kind of dignity that only comes from military traditions spanning generations. Richard Redding, 71 years old, had done his own service in Cyprus back in the 70s. His back was straight, despite arthritis that made him wince with every step. His medals from the Queen's Silver Jubilee pinned neatly to his dark suit jacket. Beside him, Margaret clutched a black handbag with hands that hadn't stopped trembling since the notification officers arrived at their door. James's sister, Anna, barely 23, held a bundle of worn letters tied with a blue ribbon. Every letter her brother had sent from Helmand, full of jokes about the food and promises to be home for Christmas. She'd read them so many times the ink was starting to fade, but she couldn't let go of his voice. People in the crowd knew what they were seeing. Office workers stopped talking to stand with their heads bowed. Tourists put down their cameras. An old man with a poppy pinned to his coat stood at attention, his military bearings still clear decades after he left the service. This was what respect looked like: quiet, deep, and complete. The procession had been going for 20 minutes when a woman near the barriers started pointing down Whitehall and whispering to the man next to her, "Police coming. Coming fast." Others followed her gaze. You could see it on their faces. First confusion, then growing concern. Why would police be racing toward a funeral procession? What could possibly be wrong? An old soldier with a military cross attached to his jacket shook his head in a sad way. "Traffic division," he said, recognizing the yellow and blue livery. Bloody traffic division coming to a soldier's funeral. A sharp police whistle and the loud growl of a diesel engine broke the holy silence. A bright yellow and blue Metropolitan Police traffic unit car came speeding around the corner from Parliament Street, its emergency lights flashing against the government buildings like a disco in a cathedral. People instinctively stepped back as the car mounted the pavement slightly, its tires screeching. The driver clearly hadn't bothered to check what kind of procession he was interrupting. The car slammed to a halt right in front of the guard, angled to block their path. Doors flew open with such force that several people watching flinched. Inspector Colin Mercer stepped out like he owned the street. He was in his mid-40s, built like a rugby player who had gone soft around the edges, and had a mustache that looked like it was always irritated. He had been with the Met for 22 years, most of it in traffic enforcement, where he had built a reputation for being absolutely ruthless about keeping London's roads moving. It didn't matter if you were a cabinet minister running late or a tourist who had taken a wrong turn. Mercer enforced traffic laws like they were holy scripture. Two younger constables stood next to him, looking like they would rather be anywhere else. Their bright yellow jackets stood out against the dark and gray of the funeral procession. "Okay, that's enough of this nonsense," Mercer said, and his voice cut through the already tense crowd. "You can't just shut down Whitehall in the middle of the day. Traffic is backed up all the way to Westminster Bridge. Time to finish this." The guards didn't stop. Wycliffe's eyes stayed on that invisible point ahead that ceremonial guards are trained to look at. But he told the bearers to stop only a few feet from where Mercer was standing with his hand up like a stop sign. "This is a sanctioned military escort," Wycliffe replied, his voice full of the kind of authority that comes from years of issuing commands while under fire. "The route has been cleared and approved through the right channels." Mercer laughed a brief, humorless laugh. "By who? A colonel in the army who thinks his toy troops can block a major road? Sergeant, take a look about you. This is London in the 21st century, not a medieval parade field." The word parade hit the family like a slap. Margaret's face crumpled. Anna's grip on her brother's letters got so tight that the paper started to wrinkle. Richard's jaw clenched so hard that you could hear his teeth grinding. The people watching shifted uncomfortably. Phones started coming out of pockets, not to film the coffin anymore, but to record what was clearly about to become a fight. "Inspector," Wycliffe said, each word carefully chosen. "Corporal James Redding of the Royal Marines died in Helmand Province while protecting a civilian evacuation point. He saved the lives of 14 people, 3 of whom were children. His escort will go on as planned." But Mercer wasn't paying attention. He was already turning toward the throng and speaking loudly, as if he were delivering a news conference. "You see this? Some guards prefer to dress up for their parade, which is why half of London's traffic is stuck, as if the typical Londoner cares about dazzling buttons and crimson tunics." The people watching were shocked. Someone in the crowd yelled, "That's a soldier's funeral, you bastard." Another voice, "Show some damn respect." A middle-aged woman pushed her way through the crowd, her face red with wrath. "My husband served in the Falklands," she cried, her voice quivering with rage. "How dare you call this a parade?" Mercer turned back to Wycliffe, his face turning hot. "Look what you did, getting the people all riled up. This is exactly why we need to keep these displays off the main roadways." More people in the throng yelled, "Let them through. It's a funeral. Don't you have any shame?" The constables were getting more and more uneasy. The younger one, who seemed like he had just finished training, came closer to his companion. "Sir, maybe we should just—" "Shut up," Mercer said angrily. "I'm taking care of this." He pointed an angry finger at Wycliffe. "You and your men may march down King Charles Street. Same place, half the trouble. Not up for discussion." Wycliffe's stance didn't change at all. Corporal Redding will not be diverted through a side street. He paid for this passage with his blood. Earned. Mercer moved closer, so close that Wycliffe could smell the stale coffee on his breath. What did he get? A nice box and a show? While you all play soldier, real Londoners are trying to get to work. Richard Redding spoke out then, his voice breaking with anger and sadness. "That's my boy in there." He came out from behind the coffin, forgetting about his age and arthritis in his rage. "My kid died helping people he didn't even know. 3 kids. James got 3 Afghan kids out of a building before the bomb went off, Inspector. He might have run. He chose to stay." His voice got stronger as he got angrier. "And you call him theater? You call the sacrifice of my son a parade?" Until now, Margaret had been quiet and leaning on Anna's arm. But all of a sudden, she spoke up. "James wrote to us every week," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying in the tight air. "Every single week for 2 years. Never missed one. He said he was fighting so that kids like those Afghan babies might grow up safe." Anna's voice broke as she held out the pile of letters. "The last one came 3 days after the telegram. He wrote it the day he died. He said he couldn't wait to get home for Christmas. He was so excited to teach his nephew how to ride a bike." People were growing impatient now. Angry whispers were getting louder. An office worker in a nice suit said, "Let the family through." A group of construction workers had pushed closer, and their hard hats formed a protective semicircle behind the Reddings. Phones were undoubtedly filming, and this was the kind of situation that might go very wrong very quickly. Now a woman with a stroller was crying out loud. "I've got a son," she said to no one in particular. "He's the same age as that boy was. How can you be so mean?" Mercer looked around at the angry faces and thought about what an authority figure would do when they are too proud to back down. Double down harder. "Look, I get that you're all upset about this," he remarked, sounding patronizing. "But emotions don't run cities. Not rules. Rules do, and those rules specify that important roads must stay open during business hours." He pointed at the coffin and said, "Your son will get his honors whether he goes down Whitehall or King Charles Street. Death is death. That doesn't affect the pomp and circumstance." The words impacted the family like a physical blow. Margaret let out a strangled sob and almost fell over. Anna caught her mother, who was crying and holding both her mother's and brother's letters. An old man with medals on his coat walked out of the crowd. "You should be ashamed of yourself," he said. "That boy gave his life for his country and queen, while you spent your whole career issuing parking fines." Mercer yelled back, "And you probably got your medals for showing up. Everyone's a hero these days, aren't they?" That was it. The crowd's anger went from muttering to something worse. People pushed closer to the police tape. A group of teenagers started filming everything and streaming it live to social media, saying that the police were disrespecting a dead soldier. Construction workers took off their hard hats, which was a sure sign that they were getting ready for trouble. Wycliffe could feel the situation getting worse. His voice pierced through the clamor like a knife. "Inspector, you need to move aside. You will let this escort go ahead, and you will do it now before it turns into something we all can't handle." Mercer grinned. "Or what? You plan to just stand there and stare at me till I'm bored? You guards are just useful for that, right? Living statues in funny hats." He told his officers to line up across the road. No one can go until they agree to change their course. The two younger officers seemed unsure, but they did what they were told. They extended over Whitehall, their bright jackets making a stark contrast to the black and scarlet of the funeral procession. The crowd went wild. "Shame! Let them go! Shameful!" Voices came from all sides, but Mercer just crossed his arms and stood in the middle of the road like he was protecting the Alamo. Everything was on the edge of a knife for a moment. The guards standing perfectly still, the cops blocking their way, the family crying behind the coffin, and hundreds of witnesses documenting every second. Then Mercer made the error that would destroy his career. He walked forward and put his hand on the Union flag that was covering James Redding's coffin. He stated loudly, "This stops here," with his hand flat against the fabric. No more delays, no more problems. Time to... At that point, Wycliffe moved. He didn't break his ceremonial stance completely, but he shifted his weight just enough to keep Mercer from getting to the casket. His voice was deadly quiet. "Sir, take your hand off that flag." "What if I don't?" Mercer hissed. "What are you going to do about it?" The challenge stayed in the air for 3 seconds. Then Mercer made his second mistake. He pushed Wycliffe hard in the chest. The sergeant staggered back, losing his grip on the coffin handle. The sudden impact shook all the bearers. For a heart-stopping moment, the casket tilted forward. The Union flag, which had been perfectly folded and positioned, slipped loose under the sudden movement. Its edge fluttered free, sliding across the polished wood as the coffin lurched in the guard's desperately tightening grip. As the coffin lid shifted slightly, you could hear the faint scraping of wood against wood. For just a moment, through the gap where the flag had slipped, you could see inside, a flash of khaki uniform, the glint of service medals, and worse, the pale, still features that should never have been exposed to daylight this way. Margaret Redding's scream sounded like a siren. She fell to the ground, and Anna barely caught her before she hit the ground. "Baby, cover him up," she cried, groping desperately for the casket. "Please put a blanket over my kid." Richard yelled with such rage that it silenced even the angriest people in the audience. "You've exposed my son." His voice broke with pain that made you feel like your heart was being squeezed. "You've shown him off like some kind of carnival act." Wycliffe and his men strained to get the coffin back to its original position, straining their muscles as they lifted and leveled it. The sergeant's face turned scarlet, not from the effort but from the shame of it all, the degradation of this most sacred job. The crowd around them was silent with shock. A businessman in a fancy suit was clearly shaking. A young mother turned her kids away, her face pale with fear. The teens who had been streaming stopped talking, suddenly realizing they had seen something sacred being violated. Wycliffe's hands shook as he smoothed the Union flag back into place, tucking its edges with the desperate precision of someone trying to undo the unthinkable. His chest heaved and his jaw was so tight it looked like it was made of granite. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible but carried in the stunned silence. "You've dishonored him." Each word was carefully chosen, controlled and menacing. "You've dishonored a man who died to save children." The audience had moved past indignation and into something worse, but it wasn't rage, it was pain. Shared grief for what they had just seen. Voices rose, not in anger, but in something closer to grieving. Shame. Just, how could you? That poor family. A woman in her 80s near the front barricades was crying openly, her palm over her mouth. "I've lived in London for 30 years, she said to the man next to her. "I've never seen anything so shameful." Mercer stood with his arms crossed the whole time, looking pleased with himself. He even smiled, but it was a thin, vicious smile that caused a lot of people gasp in horror. He yelled at the throng like they were his audience. "You see what happens when you don't follow traffic rules? All this drama, all these tears, over one dead." A businessman in the throng moved forward with a face that was white with anger. "Shut your mouth. Shut your damn mouth." Mercer was on a roll now, pumped up by what he thought was his win. "This is exactly why we have rules. That's why the cops make the choices, not some guys in costumes playing soldiers." He pointed to the casket where Wycliffe was still attempting to make things beautiful again. "Look at them. They can't even carry a package without dropping it, despite all the pomp and perfection." That was when someone in the throng first saw it. A woman at the back, reaching on her toes to see over the heads, abruptly stopped moving. She pulled on her husband's sleeve and pointed past the police cars to Westminster. "Is that?" she whispered. Her spouse looked where she was looking, and his face became pale. "It can't be." In the distance, there was a low hum of engines in perfect formation that got louder and louder. It was different from the usual sounds of London traffic, more refined, more regal, the kind of sound that made people's hearts race without them knowing why. People at the rear of the throng began to notice, and a ripple started. "Look down there. Is that really who I think it is? Oh my God, it's him." The sound cut through the noise like a knife. People turned their heads toward Westminster without thinking, where a convoy of vehicles was coming in a way that made people's hearts skip a beat. Motorcycle outriders led the way, moving in a style that was sharp and choreographed. The dark maroon Rolls-Royce Phantom that belonged to only one person in the whole UK was behind them, and it was easy to see from a distance. The wrath of the audience changed into something else. People began to whisper, "Is that? It can't be. That's him. That's the king." Inspector Mercer's smug look faded as he followed their gazes. His face went pale when he realized what was coming. The two constables moved closer together, appearing very young and extremely afraid all of a sudden. The convoy slowed down and then halted exactly 50 yards from where the casket had almost fallen. For a time, no one moved or breathed. The back door of the Rolls-Royce opened, and King Charles III stepped out onto Whitehall. He wore a thick jacket to keep warm in the fall, and his face was serious and determined. There was no group of people rushing before of him, and there were no security guards blocking his way. He just went toward the scene of commotion that had brought him here, alone and without hurry. The hush that descended over Whitehall was complete. Even the sounds from the cars on the streets around it seemed to recede. Hundreds of people held their breath as they saw their king walk to the scene of a hero's funeral that had turned into a humiliation. Charles paused when he got to the coffin. He saw everything. The flag that was a little off-center where Wycliffe had tried to fix it, the tears on the family's faces, and the police inspector who still thought he was in command and was standing up to him. The king reached out without saying a word. With great care, he smoothed out every wrinkle and tucked in every edge of the Union flag with his gloved hands until the casket was perfect again. The act was simple, but it meant a lot since it was the weight of 1,000 years of monarchy. Then he looked straight at Inspector Mercer. The inspector started to talk, maybe to explain or defend himself, but Charles raised his hand a little, which was the smallest gesture conceivable to stop him. His voice was soft as he spoke, but in the calm of Whitehall, everyone could hear him. You stopped the king's guard from doing their job. He never took his eyes off of Mercer while he spoke this. You touched a soldier's coffin. You made a show out of a family's grief. Each phrase hit like a judge's sentencing. And you have the nerve to talk about traffic management. Mercer began to answer, stammering as he tried to explain himself. Your Majesty, the rules clearly say. Charles raised his hand again, which made him stop. When he started talking again, his voice was even quieter, making everyone strain to hear. Inspector Mercer. The fact that the king knew his name made the man tremble. 22 years with the Metropolitan Police, a great record in the beginning of your profession, honored for gallantry during the London Bridge assaults, commended for serving the community in Southwark. Mercer's face went from confused to horrified as he figured out where this was going. And now, Charles said, his voice full of power, you will be remembered as the man who attacked a funeral procession, who showed the body of a hero to the public, and who made a mother scream as she watched her dead son's dignity be taken away. Mercer felt like he was being pummeled with words. His face changed from red to pale to ash gray in a matter of seconds. One of his constables was even backing away from him, as if his shame might spread. Charles's voice got even lower, until it was almost a whisper. Corporal James Redding died serving his country. He gave up his own life to save others. And you, he said, his voice as cold as steel, made his sacrifice seem like an inconvenience. The king stopped for a while to let the words sink in. When he spoke again, every word sounded final. That can't be forgiven. He didn't need to yell. The silent power of his words was worse than any loud voice could have been. There was no noise at all on Whitehall. Not a cough, a murmur, or even the sound of a car engine from the streets far away could be heard. King Charles let Mercer stand there, shaking and broken by what he had said, before moving on to something else. His eyes first fell on Sergeant Wycliffe. The guardsman was standing at attention, his jaw clenched, and his knuckles white where they still held the coffin handle. He was ashamed of what had happened while he was on duty, and ashamed that he had let a police officer touch the coffin he was supposed to be taking care of. Charles moved closer. For a time, the king and the soldier looked each other in the eye. Then the king nodded once, slowly. Charles continued, You carried him with honor. His voice was softer now, but it was still strong. No man can stop another man's disgrace. You brought back what was lost. You did not fail him. Wycliffe's face changed for the first time since the fight started. His lips clenched and his eyes glazed over, yet he stood tall with his chest out and shoulders square. The king had given him back his dignity. When Charles turned around, the crowd seemed to lean forward as a whole as he looked at the family that was grieving. Margaret Redding was still lying on the floor with her daughter, her face streaked with tears. Richard stood there like a man who had just seen the sacred privacy of his son's death violated, his fists clenched at his sides and his eyes burning with the pain of a father. Anna held the bundle of letters to her chest, shaking but determined, as if her brother's words were the only thing keeping her from falling. Charles walked slowly and carefully toward them. The soldiers moved a little to let him through, but the rest of the square stayed still. The king knelt down as he got to Margaret. He didn't just bow his head or bend down graciously. He went all the way down to one knee in front of the mother of the dead soldier. The crowd gasped in unison. People scrambled for their phones, wanting to record the event, but many just stood there, tears in their eyes. Charles gently held Margaret's hand between his gloved fingers. When he spoke, his voice was full with sadness, yet steady with conviction. Mrs. he said, Redding, don't worry about your son. People will remember him. He devoted his life for others, and this country can never repay him. Margaret shook her head weakly and cried. They let everyone see him. My son, they found him, as if he were nothing. Charles's grip on her hand got a little tighter. His eyes, which were full of his own feelings, locked onto hers. No, he responded firmly. He is not nothing. He is everything we should try to be. Bravery. Give up. Responsibility. He is the best of Britain, and I will give back what was taken from him today. He carefully stood up, still holding her hand, and finally let it go with respect. The king turned to Richard and straightened his shoulders. You raised a son who lived up to the best values of this country. People will speak his name with respect for many years to come. Richard, who had been as still as a statue until now, broke. His lips quiver, his face crumpled, and for the first time since Whitehall went silent, he bowed his head, not to a king but as a father in thanks. Finally, Charles looked at Anna. She was holding the letters so firmly that her knuckles were white. Charles replied softly, You have his words, and his gaze went to the package she was holding. Let them guide you. Let them remember you, that he was more than simply a soldier. He was a brother, a son, and a man who loved. When the sadness is too much to bear, remember that he offered you those words as a gift. Keep them safe. Anna's chin shook. She nodded, unable to say anything, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Charles looked back at the casket, and his face got gloomy again. He turned so that his remarks could be heard by not just the family, but also the hundreds of others who had come, and the cameras that were now streaming live around the world. Corporal James Redding will not leave this street in shame. He will walk down Whitehall, past the cenotaph, through horse guards, and into history with all the honors his country can give him. And now he will do it. The throng roared in approval, not cheers or applause. Hear, hear, they said. God bless the king, exclaimed the aged soldier. Stop, shouted the woman with the pram. Voices rose in agreement, not celebration, but with resounding agreement, calling for justice and honor to be restored. Charles took a step back and nodded to Sergeant Wycliffe once. Take him forward, the king said. Wycliffe's jaw stiffened. His voice, firm and formal, boomed out. Bearer party by the center. Quick march. The guards moved ahead together, the coffin firm again, and the Union flag clean. The throng divided like the water, not because of the police, but out of respect for the occasion. King Charles personally was there, just behind the coffin of Corporal James Redding, leading the procession along Whitehall. Mercer stood still, pale and shaking, while the crowd moved around him, their attention on the king and the dead soldier. He had lost. It was finished. And that's when everything changed. What had started as a fight on the street between an obstinate inspector and a heartbroken guard had grown into something far more. The king himself was now carrying Corporal James Redding's coffin down Whitehall, and all of a sudden, the whole country was watching. Before I tell you how the country reacted to what happened next, make sure you subscribe. These are the kinds of stories that the mainstream media don't always cover fully, but here we tell you the truth. Now, let's go on. There were cameras everywhere, phones, news crews, and even tourists who didn't know what they were filming at first. Within minutes, clips of the king adjusting the Union flag with his own hands were all over social media. TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram were all full of the same moment, which was replayed over and over. Some called it the silent rebuke, while others just called it the king in the coffin. The crowd moved with the coffin. Whitehall, which is usually full of traffic and tourists, had turned into something else entirely, a funeral march, a hallway of silence and respect. Veterans raised their hands in salute. Mothers pulled their children closer and told them to remember what they were seeing. Office workers leaned out of windows, ties loosened, and some had tears on their faces. Something amazing happened at the cenotaph. Normally the monument is quiet, except on Remembrance Sunday. But on that day, without any planning or announcement, hundreds of voices began to sing. At first they were quiet, but then they got louder and louder, until the whole street was filled with an unaccompanied chorus of God Save the King. Imagine that. A hymn that is usually sung at stadiums or state events suddenly starts to break out among regular people, echoing between government buildings, and carrying the coffin forward on a wave of sound. Even the guards, who were trained to stay expressionless, felt it. One of them closed his eyes for a second as he marched, letting the sound wash over him. Inspector Mercer. He was still standing by his police car, looking pale and with his radio hanging uselessly at his side. The two constables who had backed him up earlier had quietly melted into the crowd, no longer wanting to be seen at his shoulder. For Mercer, the humiliation was complete. The king's words had cut deeper than any disciplinary tribunal ever could. He knew, as everyone knew, that his career had just ended, not with retirement, not with ceremony, but in disgrace on a live stream watched by millions. Charles walked behind the coffin, all the way to horse guards. He never wavered. The cameras never saw anything but calmness, but those who were closest to him later swore that his eyes were wet as they passed the cenotaph, that the king himself had shed a tear for Corporal James Redding. And this is what the official channels tried to downplay. When the coffin got to St. Paul's, the king didn't just step aside and let the service start. He went inside, sat with the family, and stayed with them the whole time. No distance, no pomp, just a man mourning one of his soldiers. For weeks, the story was in the news, but more importantly, it became a legend. Veterans called it a moment of redemption. Families who had lost their own sons and daughters in uniform said it felt like their sacrifices had finally been recognized. Even people who didn't like the monarchy agreed. Charles had done what few leaders ever do. He had turned shame into dignity, weakness into strength, and division into unity. And Mercer, the video of his sneer, shove, and words, was it worth it? For one dead soldier would accompany him for the rest of his life. He quit within days with the press hounding him, his co-worker abandoning him, and others online cursing him as the man who sought to disgrace a hero but ended up being humiliated by a king instead. But Sergeant Wycliffe, he got a promotion. When asked afterward what he remembered most about that day, he didn't say anything about the shove, the coffin slipping, or even the king's scolding. He just said, "I'll always remember the time His Majesty knelt down in front of Mrs. Redding. At that point, I knew James would always be remembered." And this is where the story went from being a scandal on the streets of London to being a major event in British history. The cameras never stopped rolling while the king walked behind Corporal Redding's coffin. The push, the fall, the mother's scream, and the king's scolding were all there, edited together, uploaded, and spreading quicker than anything the palace press office could possibly control. Before the procession even got to St. Paul's, clips with titles like "The Day the King Stood Alone" and "Mercer's Shame" had millions of views. Hashtags like "Honor Redding," "Silent Rebuke," and "Mercer Must Go" went crazy. And here's something most people don't know. That night, the Home Office had an emergency call. Ministers, police commissioners, and even staff from Downing Street were arguing, panicking, and trying to figure out how to deal with the fallout. Charles had done something they couldn't control in just one afternoon. He had shown the world how far apart the government and the people were. But let's stop here. You need to witness what happened during the burial before we talk about the political ramifications. When the coffin finally got to St. Paul's, something amazing happened. Charles broke royal protocol and didn't hang back or take the royal pew. Instead, he quietly followed the Redding family to the front row, where he was almost unnoticed at first. And if you believe that didn't shake things up in the establishment, you are incorrect. The service was serious and lovely, but one moment stood out. When the last hymn ended, everyone in the cathedral waited for the archbishop to offer the blessing. Instead, Charles himself rose up. He gazed out over the filled cathedral and stated in a low but steady voice, "Today, Britain buried not only a son, a brother, and a soldier, but also a man who taught us what it means to give up. Corporal James Redding is not simply a member of his family or his unit. He is a member of the whole country. And as your king, I promise you this, he will never be forgotten." Everyone in the church stood up. Veterans saluted. Families cried. The sound of applause, which is rare in such a holy place, echoed through the building like thunder. Outside, Inspector Mercer was nowhere to be seen. He had been quietly taken off duty, his radio taken away, and his badge suspended. By the next morning, the tabloids had their front page. The king's wrath splashed across the Daily Mail. The Guardian ran, Charles steps in where authority failed. Even the Times, which is usually careful, wrote, "A monarch reminds us what duty means." And Mercer, you already know what happened to him. His career was over, and his reputation was ruined. His name will always be linked to that one moment when hubris met honor and lost. But for the Reading family, the guards, and the many strangers who stood in silence on Whitehall that day, there was something else. A memory. A time when the king knelt, adjusted a flag, walked behind a coffin, and showed Britain and the world what dignity looks like. History doesn't always happen in palaces or parliament. Sometimes it happens on a regular street, in the middle of a funeral procession, when one man says enough is enough. That's why people still talk about it years later. They still share the clips and remember the name Corporal James Reading. Because of a single day. Because of a single king. Because of one decision.